Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here again after the very short coffee break. And now we're going into a presentation of other suggestions and policy recommendations that have been made in the project. I wanted to clarify a couple of things that came up in the discussion before. People seem to ask what is the proposition, what are the proposals that came out so far? And I wanted to stress that in case some of you missed it, actually, Professor Annan talked specifically about creating a fourth body of government. And I would like to point out that the Conference for the Future of Europe was really talking about a fourth body as well. So it is not as controversial as some of you may have thought it is. And Ian Walker talked very, very specifically about citizens' committees or assemblies or panels advising parliamentary committees when they discuss draft laws. As you know, in most of the countries, parliaments have got parliamentary committees which discuss the draft law, and then they propose to the assembly, to the total assembly, what to do about it. And there's a second discussion that follows. Well, the proposal is that citizens should be consulted by the parliamentarians before they go to the plenary. Okay, so that's to make it clear. And there's one more thing that I'd like to answer in terms of the question that was posed. Yes, we are aware of the problems that arise in certain countries which do not really practice liberal democracy. And I will insist on using the twin term liberal democracy and not democracy by itself. Those of you who have dealt in political science will understand why I insist on this. Now, our approach is not that we ignore the problems that exist in other countries that do not really, although they appear to be democratic, they may be playing a little bit, they may sort of shorthand democracy somehow. But it is our belief that we have to deal first with the problems in the countries that do practice liberal democracy. Because if these countries fail, then that's the end of it. And it is not a question of exporting the model. That has been tried with disastrous results, I would say. The problem is to lead by example. So we need to have our own house in order before we go further down. Okay? This is just as a general introduction to answer some of the questions that were raised before you had the time run over, you end up with your coffee break. Now, let us start on the presentations from our illustrious company up here. And may I ask the co-founder and president of the EIDOS Foundation, Cristian Movilă, to take the floor.
Thank you very much for having me here. The video earlier is how we start the unfinished democracy in Bucharest this year. I don't have knowledge about democracy much, but I organized this together with Achilles and with Athens Democracy Forum because I thought that we can really put a light on a country that without fight for democracy, we will not have it anymore. And I believe very much that if every one of us, starting with businesses, will understand that democracy is not about politicians, it's about us, it's about businesses that will be implicated in the decision, in making pressure on governments, we will not have democracy. And without democracy, they don't have businesses. So this is how we started in Bucharest. And we had 3 strong, in my opinion, solutions from the survey that we did with the citizens: the lack of civic education, the lack of civil engagement, and the lack of transparency.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay. Well, difficult subject, the issue of information. And I will ask Adriana Hernández, who's the executive director, well, I'm sorry if I mispronounce everything, Adriana, of the Fundación Innovación para el Desarrollo. And she was our partner in Bogota. And Adriana, will you go ahead?
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you, Aquiles, for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here to share with you some of the results of our consultation in Bogota last June 8th. So Colomba and Andrea already referred to most of the results. I would just like to make an emphasis on 3 key messages. The first is citizen consultation concluded that people are aware that sometimes they think their opinion is the truth. And I think this is a very powerful message that we should maybe analyze further. Why people tend to be confident on their own thoughts as that being the truth. And this can be widespread because if social media replicate this kind of thought or magical thought, as somebody also mentioned earlier, we have a widespread misinformation. Second, people are also aware that they are not so knowledgeable, that they sometimes are incapable of understanding where a fact is and where an opinion is. So that is why I think our conclusion of providing the public opinion and the public judgment with elements such as an index to understand where there is a difference between fact and opinion may be very useful. To have this index be built with citizen participation led by citizens, I think also reinforces the fact that we need more inclusion in order to have more trust in democracy. And there is just one slight difference between the conclusion in Bogota and our own personal contribution, and that is that not only media should be labeled. I think labeling actors that are part of the social media environment with a lot of followers, be them politicians or not, having public responsibilities or not, is also something to observe, because many followers leads to having a lot of responsibility on the messaging that you provide through your outlets. So that would be my contribution. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, thank you. Well, everybody is being very brief, so you'll have plenty of time to ask questions afterwards. May I ask Marcel Schepp, who is the advisor for international party dialogue at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and who's worked, he was in the first year, from the first year with us, working on the project. Marcel.
Yeah. Very good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak here. I might be not as brief, but I hope I won't exceed five to 6 minutes. I recently went to a conference where, to my surprise, one participant remarked, paraphrasing here, of course, 3 years ago we discussed all these innovative theories on democracy, and now, 3 years later, we are almost talking about the end of democracy theory. What happened? While I certainly do not agree with the latter, the actual point here is more subtle, I feel. When discussing democracy, we need to be more consistent and confident alike. Evident democratic backsliding should and cannot lure us into singing a swan song for liberal democracy prematurely. And the same goes for political parties. Integral to our understanding of democracy, and I'm quoting the German Constitution here, informing the political will of the people. Well, political parties seem to have come out of fashion as of recent. And I believe this is wrong. Our contribution to the Building Blocks project last year closed with the observation that expectations towards an increased representation and participation through political parties are not matched by an equally high support for personal representation and participation. A representative survey, not poll, we conducted supports this result. Political parties are neither expected to explain politics more, nor to give more responsibility to the so-called common people. They are simply expected to do their job. Now, what that is depends on who participates. Hence, our recommendation was to open political party membership to different modes of involvement, both by introducing more open, thus inclusive instruments of participation, and by harnessing digital technology effectively to become more accessible to participate. Which is hardly a groundbreaking recommendation, you might say. I believe that merits to look at the critique as well. Last year's Athens Democracy Forum, the approach was deemed too theoretical, for it assumes political parties to be the most effective and desirable instrument of participation, which I would call the idealist critique. Our own Democracy Forum, also last year, the approach was deemed not practical, for it disregards contexts in which political party membership is neither attainable nor consistent, which I call the realist critique. And fundamentally, the approach is both undemocratic in spirit and undue in practice, for it is not our, but the members' prerogative to decide for their political parties what to do, which I would call the self-critique. So what's the point of this whole exercise then, you might ask? And this is where the deep dive comes in. By principle, it is imperative to the democratic function of political parties to choose their instruments of participation themselves, for good and for bad. Prescribing reforms ex ante is neither normatively nor empirically sound, as there is no clear and consistent evidence for their correlation with more intra-party democracy, save more democracy. By practice, it is imperative for the independence of civil society to acknowledge the competitive nature of political parties. Prescribing reforms ex ante here should not fall into the trap of assuming that more members equal more participation equals more democracy. There is, however, enough empirical evidence for more intra-party democracy to assume a correlation with more participation, inclusion, and involvement for all members at all levels. And here I can share some preliminary results of 2 studies we commissioned that are forthcoming. Over time, there has been a shift in intra-party democracy from consensus-based to competition-based procedures, most notably expressed in electing rather than selecting the leadership. This is ideally accompanied by a higher degree of self-empowerment regarding candidates' conduct, inclusion of party wings, and participation of the so-called ordinary party members. There is no empirical evidence so far that more digital parties fare better. The results vary widely depending on party, society, country, and so forth. It is, however, evident that more dialogue-oriented digitalization leads to more communication between members and party leadership. Electing party leadership, in principle, can be considered an effective instrument for more intra-party democracy because, once introduced, it can only be avoided at an increased cost, for example. Dialogue-oriented digitalization, if done well, of course, can contribute to increased involvement of party members, thus mobilizing party membership to exert more influence. To conclude, I would like to recommend, firstly, political parties should elect their leaders through general, direct, free, equal, secret, and transparent intra-party elections open to all members, ideally at all levels. And secondly, political parties should prioritize digitalizing dialogue-oriented processes that directly or indirectly affect and ideally enable their members to participate. My point, in conclusion, is this. It is a disservice to democracy explaining its regression with the dysfunction of political parties. Rather, we should enable them to function better, possibly by participating ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. I will now call upon Declan O'Brien, who is the Senior Project Manager for Elections and Democracy at the Kofi Annan Foundation, to say a few words about voting.
Yes.
Thank you, Declan.
Thank you. Great. Thanks. I feel bad now being the only one who prepared a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to ignore that, right? Or what I'll do actually is just that, and we can all look at Mr. Annan. So as Anthony said, we are, the Kofi Annan Foundation is part of the Building Blocks project, and we are looking at the power of voting sort of pillar of that, which suits us down to the ground. It's very much in line with the approach that we have within the broad spectrum of democracy support work. We initially came to it through a sort of peace-building, conflict resolution lens almost, in the sense that over a decade ago now, we started looking at the number of elections that were leading to violence. Mr. Annan was called in often to mediate on some of those. So we started looking at working on electoral integrity as a way of ensuring that elections didn't become violent. So the question of voting is, of course, central to that. And it's kind of a fun one to be working on within the context of the ADF, because as I'm sure you've noticed from earlier presentations, and if you've been here in past years, there is a very vibrant community of people here working on sort of expanding participation and reducing the centrality of elections within democratic processes. And of course, that's absolutely necessary. We need to find other ways for people to have a say in how they're governed and by whom. And the problem with elections, in part, is that because in so many places it all comes down to elections and everything is decided by elections and the stakes are so high, that is what encourages and promotes, you know, so many negative behavior. So we are happy to be working on this, and what I thought I'd do quickly today, as Anthony said, the plan for sort of the next couple of days is to go into some of these policy recommendations that came out of the consultations in a bit more detail, and then ask ourselves on Friday, I think it's going to be, you know, what concretely as a group, as a network, as partners, we can do on some of these issues. And the power of voting consultations took place in Tel Aviv and Nairobi. Colombe and Andrea went through some of those sort of the priority issues that came out of those earlier. And I just kind of want to maybe raise some of the other ones that came up and give a sense of where perhaps we might be best placed to act. There are some ideas that came up that were really good, really interesting policy recommendations, changes that could make a big difference, but being realistic about who we are and the network that we have and the resources that we could mobilize, just maybe we're not the best placed. So I don't want to, before you get too critical, don't assume that the fact that something might not be right for us is actually some sort of reflection of the merit of that particular idea. Having said that, there were a couple of ideas that were a little bit out there. And I think some of the ones that we won't take forward, for example, although, you know, feel free to find me at the breaks and argue your case, there was a suggestion, for example, for the implementation of blockchain voting. Personally, I don't think either blockchain or voters are ready for that yet. I mean, central to the question of electoral integrity is the idea of trust and transparency, and I just do not think that there is sufficient trust there in what blockchain can do in order to make it a positive within electoral processes. There was also a suggestion that we could expand perhaps the number of positions for which people vote. So not just senators or presidential candidates or whatever, but you could include, for example, members of the judiciary. Again, a little bit torn on that one personally, but I don't think it's something that we as a group would want to take forward in any case. There are other things I think that would make a real difference within the local context of an election. I mean, people, I think, within the Nairobi discussion expressed a real demand for more opportunities, more in-person events so that they could actually meet with candidates and have those exchanges. Again, not a bad idea at all, but not something I don't think that we as a group want to or can really take on. But there were some other interesting ideas, some policy recommendations that perhaps we could lend support to or run sort of advocacy campaigns around or support others who are working locally on these. Again, not sold by all of them, but it would be great to have your views at the end or over the next couple of days. And they're not necessarily radical, but the first is quite interesting, which was a suggestion to lower the voting age to 15, which controversial, not necessary in many cases, but again, there are, particularly in some of the countries that we work, you know, there are some countries in Africa where, for example, the average age is around 15. So, you know, if you're not going to include those people in an electoral process, then your electoral process is quite exclusionary already. So I think there are some places where that actually is a very interesting idea. Another one that comes up a lot is quotas for political parties and for actual candidates as well, to make sure that, you know, politics is more diverse. Nothing radical or new in that. It's been implemented in some places to great effect. It's theoretically in place in other places, but isn't really adhered to. But again, that's another interesting idea. The question of fully transparent political party funding has come up a lot. That is a question and a problem as old as political parties and democracy itself, and I think is something that we as a community need to pay more attention to. This challenge of opaque political financing is huge. We had the idea of blacklisting corrupt politicians already. And then two other ones that came up that are quite interesting, maybe, are the question of mandatory voting, which, again, is implemented in some places, works in some places. I think, personally, you need to have a lot else in place already for that to work. So maybe it's kind of leaping ahead a little bit. But the other one that's quite interesting as well is ranked choice voting, which is something that, again, is working in a couple of places, which is quite, I think, has the potential to reduce the stakes around elections, the polarization, the sort of incredible hate speech that we see amongst candidates. So that's something that we might be able to put our resources behind. And then quickly, the last one, which I think we should spend more time thinking about, is this question of having some sort of mechanism to ensure that youth priorities and youth issues are heard around elections. And there's an interesting model from Kenya where they developed a youth manifesto where initially it was a consultation and they went out and they spoke to young people across the country and they got all their priorities, and that's, you know, a first step, fairly straightforward to do. But what they did then, which was really interesting, is they got all of the young candidates from every political party together, which wasn't easy. It took time. They had to build the trust. But they basically got them to agree amongst themselves a set of priorities based on these consultations. And each of them went back to their own political party then and got the party to endorse it and make it part of their electoral campaign. It became a platform, which meant that young people knew that really whoever was going to win the election was going to act on these issues. So I'm going to leave it there, but happy to have your thoughts on these over the coming days.
Thank you, Declan. I will go a little bit ahead with the program. Strictly speaking, I would use my double role here as talk about AI and ethics, but we did mention this morning, so I will skip this because there's nothing much more to add, except to say that this is not a new issue. It has been on the table and in books. I picked out of my bookcase the other day a book by Alvin Toffler, which was written back in 1980, and there was a quote in it when he's saying that it's a new revolution that's going to create completely new civilization. And he had a very interesting quote, and I will stop after this. He said, "Did we come here to laugh or to cry? Are we dying or are we being born?" And one more quote, again on the same subject. You've heard of Susanna Zuboff. She's done a lot of work on these things. One of her first books was In the Age of the Smart Machine, The Future of Work and Power. And the question that was posed to her back in the late 80s was very, very simple. Are we going to be working for a smart machine, or will we have smart people around the machine? Okay, so it's an old issue, the ethics. So I will stop here and I will ask for the youth hack to intervene here. Ken Zasifi.
Is it? Okay. Hello. Hi. My name is Kenza Sifi. I am Moroccan. I'm a student of international relations at Al University. Truly honored to address the Democracy and Culture Foundation today as an attempt to bridge the gap between theory and practice. I felt called out while reading the Phase 2 Stream B, and I would like to address some issues related to the building block. Biotechnology is a building block for democracy. It is undeniable that biotechnology holds transformational power, and it manifests, for example, in revolutionizing the agriculture sector, like developing crops withstanding droughts and saline soils and fortified minerals and vitamins, stuff like that. This scientific sector, being highly commercial, increases tensions in democratic countries, or liberal democratic countries to be more specific, and creates even higher problems for local communities and non-democratic ones. Local farmers are set to fulfill the demands of the global markets, and adding to existing vulnerabilities in the supply chains, and with climate change, those vulnerabilities increase. My recommendation is that the democratic governments have the capacity to create mediation between global corporate interests and local demands through, for example, the creation of centers that would help people survive market disruptions. Moving on to the technical nature of biotech, it is advanced in the Phase 2 as a really good justification for the sectarian choice of experts. Yet it does not include the perspectives influenced by the trickle-down effect of the policies implemented. This especially applies to the agricultural sector that we all heavily depend on. My last point is the implementation method is articulated with a stress test approach on citizens' assemblies. Ideally, democracy holds the human as the knowledge producer and the knowledge holder, rather than being subjected to a tolerance test coming from private sources for policies. It draws the line and creates more disparity. And that is why we need, again, third parties to be inclined toward local communities' well-being. By accessing real-time, open resources, raising awareness about their transparency, and never forgetting who is truly behind them. Thank you.
Now, Keddes from the University of Morocco, and I will now call upon Mel Metis from the Franklin University of Switzerland for his second youth hack.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here and honored to be able to give constructive criticism about the implementation process of the building blocks, specifically with regard to where and how they are being executed. So firstly, the location of the roundtable discussions could be shifted to areas with more of a direct connection to the matter at hand. While some of the building blocks locations have been diversified from the predominantly Western established democracies, there is still a disconnect between roundtable discussions regarding issues that have a direct influence to the city or the country at large. For example, implementing panels regarding topics like ethnic divides in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, would be much more engaging for citizens who believe that their civil and social strifes are being heard at both a more personal and international scale. This could be done by leveraging local academics, local politicians, and just the general public at large, creating a much more inclusive environment, and an environment that I believe will align a lot with one of the core values of democracy being involving the whole population. My second point is that it would be very useful for the building blocks to gather citizens and experts together to exchange thoughts and to decipher the potential policies that will ultimately affect the public livelihood. These forums, while great in their nature, are ultimately void of this virtue and perceived as events that are only accessible to the privileged. Fostering a dialogue between citizens, policymakers, and the experts in this room could mirror the political system that was promoted by the ancient Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, who both directly binded politics with ethics in theory, but if not in practice, creating a more trusting environment. A more trusting environment. Sorry. Unfortunately, this system has been tainted by a Machiavellian model, where our society is being ruled by more fear, and our governments are ruling in a sense that prioritizes more achieving goals that are being executed whether or not they're moral. This gives rise to a system, or this gives rise to conspiratorial tendencies without the opportunity for the public to engage and question the type of expert information we are receiving in this very room. Solutions to the dilemmas facing the attainment of a functional democracy will utterly be corrupted by outlandish theories and mistrust. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Maël. Now I'll open the floor now to questions. Please, you may address them to any of the speakers. And that's your opportunity now. Don't miss it. Please. Can we have the mic over here, please?
Thank you. My name is Jim Trengrove from Lake Jackson, Virginia. I wanted to ask about voting and mandatory voting, and it's a debate that we have in the States a little bit. And I know Australia has mandatory voting. Is there any evidence that mandatory voting encourages the citizens to be more aware of what the issues are, or do they just sort of check the boxes because they're obligated to? Are they more engaged as a result?
Yeah, I'm on the fence about mandatory voting. As I said, I'm not sure. I think you need certain preconditions there, and even if those exist, you do run into questions, I think, about sort of violation of liberties, and does it violate a citizen's right not to participate if they want to? I'm not going to deflect too much, but I'm wondering, Ian, since you're sitting right there and are Australian, in terms of how it's made a difference, if at all, in Australia, is there any evidence that it has increased awareness and participation?
So yes, compulsory voting. When you think about it, it's compulsory to turn up and get your name ticked off. It's not compulsory to actually write a number in. The problem that it solves is if you think about only 40% of the voters turning up at the ballot box, in the US, you've got to run candidates that are so extreme that they incite people to turn up. We don't have a get out the vote problem, so it results in less polarising candidates. So it's not about having more informed voters, it's about the nature of candidates who can win. If in America you have a middle road candidate, who's going to bother turning up either of the way? Australians, we've got to turn up anyway, so the incentives are different.
Any more questions?
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Asinyanga Polo. I'm Ugandan, and I'm studying at International Christian University in Japan. So my question is about the overall process of democracy, because I consider elections to be the biggest pillar of democracy. And from the presenters, from the start of the forum, you've been talking about democracy, but actually you've been talking about how to make elections maybe more inclusive, yet the actual fact is the elections themselves are lacking credibility among the citizens. For example, in Africa, or maybe in the country where I come from, we hold elections, but they're all trashed because they are rigged, So elections are made for formality, but then at the end of it all, the hopes of the people are just trashed because the president or the government just puts it off, and then they consider what they already want to do. Because they want to stay in power, they just do it for formality for the international world to see that, yes, we held the elections, but literally, there's no democracy over there. So I keep questioning or wondering why we are thinking about maybe reducing the age limit to 15, which is, I feel, beating around the bush, because the real issue is how to actually make elections more effective, how to ensure that the Electoral Commission or maybe the president has no hand in the results of the elections. Once we address this, then we can try to touch these other issues that come up, like maybe reducing the age limit or something like that. But the main issue that needs to be addressed, or maybe that I would like to hear from this forum or from this Congress, is how can we ensure that the elections are neutral, that the president or the Electoral Commission actually has no hand in the elections. Thank you so much.
I mean, I can speak to that for a second if there's no other question immediately. I mean, look, I think you're absolutely right. And if I can take the continent of Africa as an example, I think nearly every country in Africa holds elections. The number of them that actually can be counted to be democracies is maybe half a dozen, if less. And the challenges to electoral integrity, the challenges to making sure that elections are a credible way for people to have a say in how they are governed and by whom, are numerous. And we could talk, I mean, come and find me separately, we could talk for hours about this. Even the question you raised about the independence and the impartiality, and beyond that, the competence and professionalism of electoral management bodies, which is central to this discussion, is only, again, one small part of the issue. The ones that I was talking about there are the issues that came up out of the consultations in Nairobi and Tel Aviv. So I was sort of restricting myself to the points that the people in those discussions had raised. But certainly, if you want to talk about the challenges to electoral integrity as a whole, worldwide, but also in Africa, yeah, I mean, we could go on for hours about that, and let's do that over the next couple of days, for sure. But don't take the specific points that I raised earlier as, that they're not silver bullets at all. There is no silver bullet when it comes to electoral integrity. There is a whole rake of reforms that need to be made to numerous institutions and the way voters and politicians act. So that is a much bigger discussion, but one I'm happy to have with you over the next couple of days.
Well, I'm afraid that we need to stop. There's a hand over there, or what? Oh, well, I'm sorry, but we're running out of time, so we'll allow one more question.
Thank you. My name is Manos Sakiris. I'm professor of psychology and neuroscience from the University of London. I do agree that electoral integrity is much more essential than the voting age, but I also think we need to address this question of voting age, and you said maybe 15. From my perspective, the question is why 15? So what's the criterion? Why not 12? Some people say 6 years old. So we need to think of it also in terms of how the brain develops, what are the cognitive capacities, and how we should approach this question. We're starting a big project to address this issue, how the political self develops in adolescence. But what's your view about the age? Why 15? Where should we actually put the dial?
I mean, 15, because that was what was suggested in the consultations. But I think you're right that we can't just pick a number out of the hat. And if you're going to look at something like changing the voting age, I think you can't do it in a vacuum. You have to consider, I mean, this doesn't just go, it's not just a question of age. I think this question of civic education and democratic values and ensuring that people understand what it means to be. Mr. Annan had a quote at one point that I'm going to probably misremember slightly, but it was basically that no one's born a good citizen or a good Democrat. You know, you have to learn that. And in places, if you can build that sort of education, that infrastructure that allows people from as early an age as possible to engage in public life and public decision-making and make informed decisions, then that's really what you need to look at. Picking a number out of the hat and just saying, okay, we're going to make it that and go for it, doesn't really make sense. You have to look at it, I think, in consideration of the rest of that society and community. And everything from local traditions to levels of education to the infrastructure that exists will come into that discussion. So the short answer is 15 because that's what I think some people in Nairobi suggested, and that's, why not, let's start looking at that. But it's not something that you can just decide, I think, on the basis of a number. So.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'll have to stop this here, and I want to thank the panel for being here, for answering the questions. Thank you very much. You're excused.